Hello, everyone, and welcome to video 4 for chapter 25. And in this one, we're going to be talking about Europeans in the Pacific. Now, they weren't given as much attention as the Americas, but the Pacific Islands still experienced a similar transformation due to contact with Europeans. Both saw their indigenous populations reduced due to disease and exploitation of their natural resources. Let's first look at the largest island in the Pacific, one so large it's actually its own continent, and we're talking about Australia. Now, European contact with Australia didn't really get going until the early 1600s, when Europeans realized that this was a sizable southern landmass and not just another island. The first Europeans to record contact with Australia were the Dutch. The Dutch VOC, right? In Dutch, that's how I would spell it, with the Dutch East India Company. They kind of made it to Australia in 1606, but reported that there was nothing they could use. Throughout the 1600s, Europeans really didn't make a lot of contact here. You can see the routes that they took. Okay, in the green one, here's Batavia, right? That was the main Dutch trading outpost in the East Indies. Right, they would kind of everything that went through there they taxed, and they went all along the northern one, and then this one, Tasmania, New Zealand. Okay, Van Diemen's Land, that's what it was called after the Dutch traveler who quote unquote discovered it, and then made their way up here. But this area that they kind of I guess for lack of a word, explored, discovered, whatever you want to call it, and even then in around here, it's mostly desert. And so because of this, when the Dutch landed, they're like, there's nothing really here for us. There's barely any trees even. They weren't getting to the good parts of Australia. It wasn't until Captain James Cook made his way past the Great Barrier Reef on Australia's northeast coast that Europeans started to take interest. So here's the Great Barrier Reef. This area through here, okay, it's tricky to make it along the coast because of the reef, but Cook makes his way down and eventually gets down in and around this area. Once he got down around here, this region here is about Botany Bay. This is close to where Sydney is today. Once he checked it out, he recorded and then eventually sent word back. He goes, yeah, this area is really good for settlement. He goes, all throughout here and here, this is all desert, but this area through here, this is good. So he just had to make it past the reef first. So in 1788, the British government sent a ship of about 1,000 passengers to make a settlement. 800 of them, though, were convicts, as the settlement was meant to be a penal colony. And we talked about this in a previous chapter, meaning that it was going to be mostly populated for criminals that were overflowing the English dungeons. Right, when they changed the penal laws in England and you couldn't execute somebody just for stealing a loaf of bread anymore, they didn't have a big prison system. So like, what do we do with all these people? Put them on a boat, send them to Australia and New Zealand and places like that. But for the next 50 years into the 1800s, Europeans in Australia remained very low in numbers, most of them convicts who were just herding sheep. Free settlers didn't start to outnumber convicts until the 1830s. It wouldn't be until the 19th and 20th centuries, actually, that Australia really started to be linked to the rest of the world. All right, now the Pacific Islands. Like in Australia, European merchants didn't arrive in large numbers in the Pacific Islands until the late 18th century, right, the late 1700s. This is not to say, though, that the Pacific was without significant interaction between Europeans and indigenous peoples. The first Europeans to make direct contact with the Pacific Islanders were the Spanish. In 1521, Ferdinand Magellan sailed from Spain and became the first person to cross the Pacific. This started the Manila galleon voyages we discussed in chapter 23, right? Connecting Manila to Acapulco on the west coast of Mexico, and they would take the Mexican silver and use it here, and that would be used in the economy through numerous places in Asia, and then the goods would be kind of taken through the Caribbean and then back to Spain as well, right? So this whole kind of global connection of trade. In that chapter, we talked about how he reached the Philippines, but we didn't go into detail about other islands that Magellan visited, such as Guam. Okay, he did make it to Guam. Guam is a relatively small island and a part of a chain of islands called the North Mariana ones. It's the most prominent of them. As you can see, it's really not around much. Okay, here's Hawaii. You got other areas of Micronesia and Polynesia and so forth, but Guam, it's a small island, not much there. However, they figured that it could be a good stepping stone in making their way across the Pacific on these voyages between Manila and Acapulco. So during the 1670s, Spain decided to bring Guam and the rest of the Mariana Islands under direct control of the Viceroy of New Spain, aka Mexico. Spain sent military forces to subjugate the natives and impose Catholicism there. Sounds pretty similar to what we talked about in Central and South America. And just like we heard about in the Americas, the weapon that was most effective against the people of Guam, you guessed it, smallpox. The native populations were drastically reduced and the islands fell under Spanish control. Now, European interaction in the Pacific eventually became regular occurrences, but they didn't always go so well. An example of this is our old buddy, Captain Cook, and specifically this time his experience in Hawaii. All right, so here you have Polynesia. Here is where I look for it here. Okay, you got the Cook Islands down in here. All right, and Tahiti's down in this region as well. And here you got Hawaii up at the top of the triangle. Now, after departing Tahiti in 1778, Cook sailed north and really kind of by accident stumbled upon the Hawaiian Islands. But due to his time in Tahiti, Cook recognized the Hawaiians as being of a similar ethnicity and was actually able to communicate with them. Trade and relations went well at first, but they soured after Cook left to continue looking for the Northwest Passage, right? He kept on heading north up around Canada and Alaska. You see, while Cook was gone, a number of Hawaiian women realized that they had become infected with venereal diseases from relations with Cook's crew. That got awkward. When Cook returned the following year, he received a much more hostile welcome, as you can imagine. Fighting eventually broke out over claims of petty thievery, and Cook lost his life in the battle between the Hawaiians. Now, despite petty conflicts such as this, contact between Europeans and later Americans contact between Europeans and later Americans and the Pacific Islanders, because by the 1800s, America is going to start getting involved in Hawaii. They were going to continue, and they were going to increase during the 19th and 20th centuries, oftentimes leading to negative impacts for the indigenous peoples of the Pacific, as history often shows. All right, so that wraps things up for talking about European conquest in the Pacific, and it also wraps things up for Chapter 25.